Welcome, everybody. I'm so excited to be here with you today and to have this guest with me. Gareth is going to be absolutely fantastic today. Let me quickly introduce you to who Gareth is, and then we'll dive right into it. So Gareth is a founder, producer, and director at Let's See Labs. It's an organization researching, experimenting, and discovering how self-realization impacts divisive social issues. Let's See Labs brings them to life through film, live forums, and relational discovery platforms. So super excited to be here with Gareth today. We're going to do something a little bit different. Rather than your traditional kind of one-sided interview, today it's going to be more of a conversation with both of us actually sharing stories. So I'm really excited for this format. And Gareth, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you so much, and for the kind introduction. I'm excited also to have a dialogue and see how our stories reflect each other.
100%. Gareth, could you kick it off just by sharing a little bit more about your story and a little bit more about your background?
So I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I went to UNC for undergraduate and graduate school in technology and communication. And I worked a corporate job in the Triangle for about 7.5 years, and then transitioned in the pivot of my life, more orienting towards purpose. And that led me to a world of the intersection of self-realization, consciousness expansion, and healing modalities, and what that means as we relate with the social issues and the tension and the civil unrest of what's happening in the world. And I now pursue that exploration and experimentation through film and storytelling.
That's awesome. And could you tell everybody a little bit about Let's See Labs, the organization that you're now running?
So Let's See Labs, the spirit behind the name is wanting to keep value centered on emergence and the unknown. And so the spirit behind saying, let's see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. What will happen? Let's find out. Let's be in discovery. So the laboratory is the labs, and then let's see what happens. And so that discovery process of letting things be revealed when we don't impose anything on top of it, anything that's already known or we think is right. So I think that the revelation of truth emerges in the unknown.
I love it. Can you tell me a little bit more about how you got started with Let's See Labs specifically, and kind of what led you to want to get started with that?
As I got better at listening to that quiet inner voice inside myself, sort of that compass guide that only we know. Nobody knows better for us than ourselves, really, what direction we should go at what time, in our own conscious. And as I learned how to actually listen to that voice and trust it, I realized that I was very fascinated and driven by consciousness expansion. So as I continued to immerse in the exploration of different spiritual traditions and direct experience with these things, I began at some point to realize that there was a disconnect in my perception between the brilliance of these deeper realized spiritual communities and worlds and what that could offer, and then the actual unrest, the conflict, the war, the pain, the suffering, what's really, our world struggles with, and political divides and, prejudice and hatred and fear. And so as I sought to actually understand that further, I sort of began to use the tools that I had learned from spiritual explorations, which included things like tuning into the body and understanding that there's this wisdom inside of our bodies if we can listen. And as I began to pursue that, I began to see more of the social constructs of our identities where, oh, wait a second, as a woman, I have a specific conformity that unlocks in dynamics. And as a person with white skin, that's different than being a woman or being from the United States. And I began to look at the complexity of these different identities. I found not only a sense of liberation and freedom within my own just general beingness, I also found my capacity grow, where then I could show up to do work in the world and pursue change, and where I feel I can bring my care and love in a way that's actually embodying the principles themselves versus expecting someone else to change. That led me into Let's See Labs, where it's driven by curiosity and experimentation to say, well, wait, who are the people that have done this? Who's done this in this particular religion, and who's done this in this particular country, or where is this war happening? And who are the people within these crazy contexts that have really stepped into themselves and owned their wholeness? And can I find them and talk to them and then put together, a collection of stories, and then what patterns would show? So, the pursuit with Let's See Labs and the storytelling was really driven by my own inner discovery of the liberation within breaking down those identities.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. I think we'll kind of get into the part now where we get to talk back and forth a little bit, which is super fun. So I guess the first question is, when did you first discover your purpose, and what was holding you back from discovering it earlier on?
One moment that comes to mind is when I was in a corporate job. It was fantastic. The environment was conducive to creativity and freedom. So there really wasn't anything that I could point to and say, well, that's wrong, so I need to fix it. It was actually because everything was going well, the inner conflict inside of me began to become sort of this enigma. Like, wait, why am I not okay if everything around me is going well? And so as I began to ask those questions, I remember sitting at my desk and I was researching all these other people who were doing all these cool things I thought in the world and in organization. As I was reading these things were people writing and doing, there was this distance. Here I am sitting here researching all these people, but there was a distance between, oh, they're living their dreams and I'm not. That person is doing it and I'm not. And I began to feel this divide between the world of living in into the dream versus just sort of staying put in the known world. And so I remember some of those moments, my voice came through louder, like, wow, the feeling of the pain inside began to be a point where it was like, maybe I should take a risk. Maybe it's not that person can do it and I can't. Maybe that's my limiting belief that there's a distance there. So that I remember some of those times really being very important to my gradual process of gaining the courage to take the risk to move into understanding more what I felt called to authentically in the world.
I know when you and I had a chance to connect before recording this episode, we were talking a lot about kind of that fear, the deep-seated fear that oftentimes people don't even actually really pick up on. But fundamentally, if you haven't figured out your purpose in life, there's probably a reason why you haven't. And it's probably from some sort of fear. Can you speak to that a little bit? I really like the way that you put it.
Yeah, I do. I think that fear serves as you can trace down when we're out of alignment or we're not living the life that we feel in our wholeness. I do think that there's often disowned subconscious or conscious fears that repeat patterns where we stay in loops. And so I think in my particular situation, I think some of the fears were, based around fear of the unknown, just staying in a world where I felt safe and comfortable, and taking a risk meant being open to new realities, which is actually threatening to all my relationships and in the paradigm of which I'm existing in. So having to kind of go through that existential crisis in a way that, and I think that remaining in the safe place, even though it feels comfortable on the surface, there's actually a deeper fear underneath that keeps it repetitive. So yeah, and I'm curious your experience with the fears too.
Like you said, oftentimes it is kind of subconscious, right? And it definitely wasn't something that I had thought about before we had a chance to speak on that subject. And now looking back on it, there definitely was some sort of fear that was holding me back. And I've tried to kind of dig into it a little bit. My story is a little bit more, I came to NC State here in Raleigh, and I was in the business school, and it seemed like everything was going great. I had an opportunity to study abroad, met some fantastic friends. And so everything, from the outside looked like it was going great, right? And probably a similar situation to you, at your corporate job, like everything looked like it was going great. And there was no reason why it shouldn't be, right? From the casual observer. But then of course, internally it's not going great, right?
Yeah.
And there's something missing there. There's just something fundamentally missing. And so I kind of took a step back and I asked myself, what is it that is missing? Because I did feel like, similar to what you just said, there was a distance between myself and the life that I was living, and then where I really wanted to be, chasing after my dreams, like the people that you see that are, the role models in podcasts and in books and
Mm-hmm.
on film and things like that. And I did feel like there was kind of a distance there, and it was like this block of just kind of, I knew there wasn't really anything in between us, but it felt like the distance was just huge. I had to look back. I had to look back to my past and figure out, as I was growing up, what were the things that motivated me? What were the things that really brought me a bunch of energy? And so that's what I spent a lot of time doing. I just spent a lot of time looking back and thinking, hey, what are the things I've done in my life that have brought me the most fulfillment? and how can I double down on those things? And what I looked back on was essentially, growing up, I was really a helper, and I loved helping people. I loved the idea that the people around me were successful or were happy or were not in conflict. It probably stems from my parents getting divorced from a pretty young age. I always wanted to be the person who, prevented anybody from feeling like they were stuck in the middle, or preventing anybody from having to feel pain, essentially. So that's really been what's always motivated me. Even today, I realized it manifested itself in purpose that I eventually found, which was to help people and to empower people to achieve success and to achieve fulfillment in their own lives. So that's when I kind of first discovered my purpose, was probably like my sophomore or junior year of college. And the thing that held me back from doing it earlier was honestly, I had seen companies have like mission statements and stuff like that. And I'd always thought that was great. I'm like, oh yeah, when you have a team of people, of course you have to, get them all unified around one common goal, right?
Yep.
But I'd never thought about the fact that, hey, when you're just by yourself, you should probably get yourself unified around a common goal as well, and a common reason for even having goals. I didn't know I was allowed to do that. I didn't know that that was a thing. I didn't have any specific role models that were pointing me in that direction. And it wasn't until I finally found a few role models, reading some books and listening to some podcasts, as I went through this process, that's what finally took me to that tipping point of like, hey, actually, there's no reason why individuals can't have a common purpose as well. It can be a really beneficial thing.
I resonate with a lot of that. And one thing that I was thinking about when you were sharing is about the idea of permission, and just something you said about, oh, I didn't know that I could do that. Just the impossibility is not, it seems far away, but then all of a sudden there's like a permissioning that comes through, which could be from anything. But in this case, yeah, seeing it exemplified in other people to have done it then just brings the possibility closer. So I find a lot of resonance in that approach as well. And being able to actually realize, oh, I can do that. There's a simplicity to it.
It's almost too simple to be true, right? But it actually
Yeah.
is as simple as that sometimes. Was there anything in your story was there a moment when someone or something gave you permission per se, or you gave yourself permission to kind of go down that path of defining a purpose?
Looking back at how I grew up, there was always a part of me that was very somehow hyper focused and engaged and fascinated and aware about how people pursued peacemaking and conflict resolution, and how oftentimes I would experience people who were pursuing and advocating for change, and something felt off for a really long time inside of me, that I didn't feel that they were coming with the energy of which they were preaching for. And it always bothered me. And so I think, similar to you, when I look back and I source, what is it I really care about? What was I naturally drawn to before any growing up and conformity started to influence me? And it really stems something around the capacity to embody exactly what it is that we're saying and doing, and being really integrated. And so I remember having a really supportive family who really actually gave me emotional support and freedom, which I think was really incredible. And I've also found that seeking out people who are willing to actually, like, building a community of people who will reflect the truth and who will reflect the best parts of me, that really helped. And being willing to look at some of the areas in which society might be judging or criticizing, but realizing, wait, I'm led to that, but mainstream science is maybe debunking it, or there's something weird, or that's out there in a woo-woo way. And somehow actually the community I'm around, and listening to myself and letting myself just pursue anything that's, even if it's absurd to the rest of society, getting very absurd and playful and diving in just without needing to actually fit in any way that society needed to see me, and redefining success outside of what I previously had been subconsciously following a definition of.
Redefining success. That was definitely a big part of my story too. It's especially when you're around, like, I was raised by an entire family of entrepreneurs and business people. And then, I'm obviously at the business school here at State. And so success, obviously, the mainstream version of it, especially around that sort of environment, the mainstream version of success is money, or is, material things, or is some sort of image of, facade of having achieved things, or having a title, or having a company or a position. And that was something that I thought, for a long time was the same thing. Growing up, I started a few businesses and I thought, oh, look, I'm starting businesses. Look at me. But realistically, coming to it, I started to realize that those things are much more parts of the journey, not the actual reward, right? Those are the things that you use to get there. And those are the gifts and talents that you have that you can use to get there. But they're not the end goal, because if they're the end goal, which they were for me at one point, that led to me feeling hollow or empty. I don't know if any of that resonates with you.
It does resonate. And I appreciate your distinction between seeing the tools on the journey versus the destination based of goal, and how they work together. And there's like a dance between that, the vision and the strategy. And that resonates in the sense too, that for me, I realized that feeling you spoke to about, oh, look at me, I've got these, I'm moving into this definition of success, but something still felt off. In my experience with that, as I listened to that sort of dissonance between what I thought, oh, I should be feeling this because XYZ is happening, but I'm not. And then realizing, oh, wait, I'm driven that my definition of success actually includes the feeling good. It includes feeling alive. It includes feeling whole. And so it's like, oh, well, I don't know what it is that at this moment in time that's going to induce and elicit those feelings, but the dissonance is a guidepost.
I'm really curious when you say that it includes, feeling good and feeling alive. That's really fascinating to me. Is it for you, like, have you found a difference between like the thought of being happy versus feeling fulfilled, and kind of the short-term ups and downs in life compared to the long-term fulfillment based on achieving a mission? Is that something that kind of factors in there, or is it more, I'd love to hear more about what you're saying when you're saying feeling good and feeling alive based on your purpose.
Something that I noticed that I think I might have adopted from society's beliefs is that in order to actually do good work in the world, we need to struggle. We need to be some sort of suffering battle in order to be doing good work, or to doing something that matters includes this massive, almost like battle in a way. And as I identified that, the structure of that belief system as it was running in a subconscious narrative in my life, and sort of broke that down and realized the fallacy, the logical fallacy in that belief, I realized, oh, actually, if I'm embodying the example of which I want to emanate, then I have access to joy. Like, I want to be living in that joy as an example for the world. And I'm the one that needs to take responsibility for my suffering, so that then when I'm with other people, I'm not perpetuating their suffering. And so I think that the journey towards fulfillment is sort of this byproduct of meaning that continues to kind of like ripple through as this sort of reward of following my intuition, whereas actually the joy is accessible at any moment at any time, as long as I'm in alignment.
And I definitely identify with a lot of that. The idea that joy is always accessible. It's the idea that you get to be much more in control of your emotions than typically people will make it out to be. You get to choose how you're feeling. Of course, there's always going to be external pressures, but that's something I've really been trying to keep in mind the last couple of years, is just, hey, there's always going to be things that life throws at you, but there's also always the way that you respond, and you get to choose how that is.
Yeah.
Let me dive into this next question too. So what is the process you went through, or, the questions you used to actually figure out your purpose? So boom, you're at this point where you realized, hey, I'm going down this path that I don't want to be going down. I need to make a pivot. And then what was the process that you used to actually figure out what your purpose was?
I'm really curious to hear your response to this too. Some of the key points would be around acceptance. Part of my guidepost that led up to the pivotal moment of change included feeling confused and being in pain, and being confused about relationships not working out, being confused about my job not working, like things were just not clicking. And so I think the acceptance of actually what's happening, and the not trying to resist the fact that, oh, I don't like the way things are going. I don't like I'm seeing the same pattern and I'm so mad at myself. Actually just being like, well, that's reality. this is what's happening. And so once I was able to actually reckon with the truth, then it was like the body could then actually relax enough to allow the new information to come in of what would be next. But until I was able to be in the truth, in the reality, I don't think I could even be receptive to the information of a unique purpose.
It's not something I had thought about at all. It's like really, you have to take a second to be with yourself and understand where you are before you try and chart a path to where you want to be. I love that. Were there any other steps you took after that? So now you figured out, hey, I need to make a change and I understand and I accept where I am. Were there steps that you took after that or questions you asked yourself or anything like that?
Some of the sort of the more bigger picture questions were around, why am I here? Why are we all here? Like, what are humans doing on Earth? You know, where are we going? What's the purpose of any of this? What is existence? Do I exist? Who am I? And why does any of this matter? And why is there so much suffering in the world? Like, why is everybody fighting? You know, and just this total, like, what is going on? Like that. So there was
That's
a
a big
lot
question.
right. Yeah. Like a lot of those questions just, you know, constantly asking themselves, the questions were present, you know, not necessarily with an answer, but just with an open question, inquiry all the time. And then another thing I think would be relevant would also just be taking at least the first step of action, because I don't know what new information is going to be on the next side of that risk. But whatever it is, it's all I need to know for this moment in time. I don't need to map out, you know, this whole huge plan, because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 minutes, you know? And so I think being open to the unknown and taking an action and knowing that that action is not something that is solidified forever. It's just the next step to get new information. And then I can iterate and iterate. And so being open to that iterative process of just being willing to take the first step.
And I don't know about for you, but for me as like a perfectionist and as a person who wants everything to be just right, that is the hardest thing that I struggle with. I totally identify with that. I mean, I'm totally guilty of just trying to, you know, recognizing there's a problem maybe, and then starting to work on a solution, but trying to plan out the entire solution to be just perfect and just right, rather than just giving it a shot, you know, and just
Yeah.
going out there, going out on a limb. And I love what you just said. Like, you never know what new information is going to be on the other side of that risk. I love that. Um, every time we talk, I get some sort of really good nugget I need to like write down somewhere. I love it. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm curious too about you. Like, what's your experience with some of that?
Yeah, for sure. I think a lot of it relates back in a big way. Um, you know, when I got to the point where I realized, hey, I need to have a defined purpose. For me, just being like a very analytical person, I knew I wanted it to be like a sentence, like, you know, one clear thing that I could always reference back to. And I know for some people, it's not always going to be like a mission statement. It might be more of a ambiguous thing. But for me, I knew I wanted it to be really defined. The process I went through, I basically just did some research. I was like, hey, how have some other people done this? Listened to a few podcasts, Googled a few things, read some blog posts and stuff. And I really enjoyed some of the processes, learning about some of the processes that people use. For me, I literally took a list of like 200 or 300 adjectives that I found online. And I basically developed a list of core values for myself. And then as soon as I had the core values, then it became more clear for me to define a mission. So for me, like the mission statement was almost like the sum of creating my list of core values. Those were kind of the lens. But then the other half of the lens was looking back at my past and saying, hey, what has brought me fulfillment? What has brought me excitement? And I wanted to make sure that whatever I set it to made it so that I could get through the tough moments too. You know what I mean? I feel like if you can come up with a purpose that is like, wow, even when the going gets tough, even when life throws crazy things at me, I'm still going to be so excited to wake up every day, or at least, you know, most days, to
Yeah.
wake up and take some sort of actionable step towards achieving this purpose, achieving this mission. So those were kind of some of the core things that I used to come up with it.
I really appreciate what you're saying about the distillation of understanding your values. That's so key. And I've done a similar process in that, and being able to use, distilling it down is like, oh, I care about that. Like I want to live into that value. And I appreciate your connection between the value system and then the purpose that translates out is like how you're actually the purpose comes like like a tree out of those values and becomes the way in which you can pursue that. And I think that's really beautiful. And I feel similar in that myself in terms of what guides the foundation of the purpose.
I appreciate it. And the last thing for me was just I knew that fundamentally, whatever I set my purpose to be, I would feel more fulfilled doing it if it was something where I was helping other people. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that for the majority of people, they might have a similar reckoning when they try and create a purpose. It's like, well, if you're just doing something for yourself, then it's just for you, rather than taking the time to really think through, okay, what can I do for other people, right? So that was something I knew wanted to shine through when I was creating the mission statement. So I made sure to kind of pull that through throughout the entire process.
I really align with that. And I feel the word service comes up is just
Mm-hmm.
being in like the service frequency of life and tuning in and engaging to what's happening with other people all the time and being able to show up for them.
I totally agree. So what fundamentally changed when you had a very clear mission that you were living your life by, and just kind of how did you feel in that moment and in that time that followed?
There's a twofold aspect where in one sense it was gradual change, and in another sense there was an aspect of it that was pretty quick shift. And I would say in the quicker shift part of it, there was an increasing confidence, and there's like a clear innate knowing inside. So as I took actions, I was willing to deal with whatever consequence might or may not arise because I was so clear in myself, and that clarity allowed me the courage to take the risks into the action because I can stand by this. I feel the integrity that came through, and so it doesn't mean that it will always be well received or I won't meet challenge, but I can stay with myself and stay in my integrity and the confidence that previously I wasn't experiencing. I was questioning myself all the time and wondering, did I do this right? Or, who's going to be mad at me? Or, maybe even trying to make the world like me, and that gave this sort of fake external focus on mitigating the external world, which could be seen as slightly narcissistic because I can't change anybody else. So I think it was like, whoa, that shift.
I love that. When you said like the innate knowing that you were on the right path, that really identified with me, because I did notice just a huge difference in my level of confidence in every facet of my life. Because suddenly, rather than just like doing this over here and doing this over here and doing this because it seems like the right thing to do, or maybe I make some money over here, or maybe I'm like getting towards my future over here. Instead, it was like actually every single thing that I do can relate back to this one central purpose. And for me, that was liberating in a way, because like you said, I just had clarity, so much
Mm-hmm.
more clarity. And then for me personally, the confidence really came into play. It came in a little bit at the beginning, but it came into play even more once I started making commitments to myself and to other people that I was going to start taking action towards this mission, and then keeping those commitments. I heard a great thing from Ed Milet podcast a couple years ago that was basically just confidence is the sum of how many commitments that you've kept to yourself. So if you can say to yourself, hey, self, I'm going to go out and I'm going to take this action towards achieving my purpose. And then if you keep that commitment, then automatically the next question is like, hey, well, what bigger commitment can we make next? What's the bigger thing we can do next? Rather than being in this mindset of just constantly, like, oh yeah, I say I'm going to do that as my New Year's resolution. And then, oh, well, it didn't happen,
Yep.
And
Yes.
so
Oh
really,
my-
yeah, just taking ownership of it. And therefore, when you set these little commitments, it constantly builds your confidence and allows you to accomplish so much more. That's just been my personal experience.
When you're talking about the feeling that comes from showing up to commitments and how that accumulates and the visceral feedback loop that happens, like I have little tingles on my arms when just talking about that, because I do believe there's something about honoring our own word that's related to our trusting ourself, and by extension is actually honoring and respecting other people's time and other people's experiences. And so it does feel like actually one of the pathways towards thriving in interdependence is really what you're pointing to about showing up for those commitments and that feeling that's associated. There's a beauty in that feeling.
And just to give you a compliment for a second, I mean, ever since you and I had the chance to connect first, I think like 6 or 7 months ago, every single time you and I have talked, I always felt so heard and so understood. And you were so quick to demonstrate the fact that my time was valuable and that you wanted to spend that time so we could both mutually benefit from it. It wasn't like a mentor mentee thing. It's just a friend thing. It's just a, hey, let's talk about these things that we're both interested in.
Likewise, I've felt like such a flow with you and appreciate, all you're doing too. It's like I can feel your energy is in a deeper purpose because your excitement and engagement is like right on par.
I don't know about you, it's easy to pick up on that from people. Like when you're even just talking to somebody, you can tell when like, because they're going to say like, oh, this is my purpose, and they're going to share their why per se, right? But even if they didn't say that, you can tell when somebody is talking from a deeper purpose or when they're just trying to do something more transactional or more just like in the moment, for sure.
And what's interesting when you say that is you can tell. And I think that same perceptivity is part of the inner honesty too. Like I can tell when I'm off. And that's the inner honesty. So like, it's like that same perceptivity about how we experience other people is when it's brought into how we experience ourselves. It's like, oh, wait, I'm off right now. I need to realign. Like, well, take a break.
I totally agree. A big part of what I'm trying to focus on here with the podcast and everything is sharing not just the good parts, but also some of the difficult parts and some of the more vulnerable or transparent parts. So, for me, it definitely has not, I can dive into it a little bit more. It's definitely not been easy. We make it sound like, oh, you find your purpose, you find your mission, then boom, life is just, everything works. It's all great. It all fits together. And of course, that's not exactly how it works. So could you maybe share, some of the tougher parts that you've been through, some of the more difficult parts, or just things that you're still working on?
So some of the things that come up is having to let relationship dynamics crumble. As I live into a new version of myself, it's like the old version, everything that was built around that also is in question at that moment. So being willing to be okay if people are like confused or scared because they see me becoming something that they didn't it might question their comfort. So that's part of it. And another part that I can get sort of specific with, as I mentioned earlier, when I was describing how I found a lot of liberation in questioning my socialized identities. So reckoning with what it might, the conformity of being a woman, for example, is actually having to sit with the fact that I actually saw myself in situations where I had no idea, but I was making myself inferior to people. There's a nuance to that where it's like, oh, well, instead of just saying the direct thing to someone, I dance around it, or I let them get away with something and I didn't speak up. And there's a bunch of fear embedded in that, but there was a part of it that was completely on autopilot. And so as I actually saw my behaviors and my awareness expanded of how I act relationally, and similarly with understanding more of the white skin, it's like, oh, there's actually, this is not just black versus white in America. There's a nuance to the white conformity where it's true that in certain situations, I have a subtle tendency to maybe act superior, and I don't know it. I didn't know that. So to have to say, oh my gosh, this whole time I've been in these ways been superior and these ways inferior, and not wanting to see that. And so having all this resistance come up about the truth, and that led me to some dark places of like, wow, in one sense, this is irreversible because I'm on the path. And at the same time, I felt like, a lot of like, no, fighting against it, and that took a lot of resilience that sometimes was, months.
I totally agree that a lot of times there's so much more nuance than we originally thought. And I don't know about you, but I'm definitely someone who loves for things to be like clear cut, And so it's really difficult for me to like, have some sort of principle or value in life and then have that be challenged by this like very gray area, wishy-washy type situation, right? And so, yeah, that's definitely been a difficult part for me as well.
Yeah, it's hard to sit in chaos.
100%. I'll tell you what. Some of the most difficult parts for me have been realizing that, okay, in order to achieve this mission of empowering other people, the quickest way to do that, the most impactful way to do that, and the most relatable way to do that is to share your own story, right? Because that's how people, and I'm sure you obviously know this through everything you do with Let's See Labs, sharing stories invokes human emotion and human empathy, right? And it helps people to narrow that emotional distance between people.
Yes.
That's part of why we both love video so much, is because video has this ability to feel like you're like right there with them, right? And really like,
Yes.
get somebody. And so I realized I have to share my story to achieve my mission. And then I also realized that, hey, if I want that story to be relatable and if I want people to really take something from it, I need to be incredibly vulnerable and incredibly transparent. And
Yes.
I need to just be honest with people about the daily steps that I'm taking, but not just the steps that I'm taking and not just the wins, but also the challenges and the roadblocks and the places where I fall short and the mistakes. And that is difficult. I mean, that is very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've found is that even though I've made it like, the biggest thing that I'm trying to do is just be incredibly vulnerable and transparent with people, still, like I went through the whole process of like, filming this whole kickoff video for this initiative. And
Mm-hmm.
then I looked at it, I was like, wait, I wasn't vulnerable in any of this. You know what I mean? I had to go refilm half of it. And so it's things like that where like, it's so not natural for us to share our vulnerabilities with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's so not natural. Like, people's default is always going to be, oh, let me, this person has these material things, or this person has these titles, or has this experience, and therefore they've got it all figured out, and they're like the one, and there's no problems. As opposed to actually what we're finding, especially with social media and some of the stuff, just even the last few years, I think people are getting more used to the idea of, actually, if you can see kind of like the behind the scenes and the parts where those people fall short, and if they're more honest about those, it actually narrows that emotional distance even more, and you feel even closer to them, and you can take away even more from what they're saying by an order of magnitude, really. So that's been kind of my experience, and just honestly my constant challenge to this day, and I'm sure it will continue to be, is just continuing to find ways to be vulnerable and be transparent.
I admire the commitment to that value and totally align. And I also was linking back to, as you were sharing about when you and I both were talking about how that we, prior to making pivots in life, we had moments where we were seeing other people and distancing ourselves and saying, oh, I'm not that, like that's a dream, and not here. So it's really cool to hear that in order to actually, break down that gap, it has to do with the truth of the whole story, because there's not a human that doesn't have the challenge. So to really bring in the rawness of the whole process, I think is part of service to other people, in the sense that, yeah, there are tons of scary things. This is really risky. You're going to go through all this crazy chaos and complex emotions. And I really admire that in itself, through vulnerability, as actually part of the service itself in helping people.
Yeah, vulnerability is part of the service. I totally agree. Have there been any strategies in your life that you found to help to remind yourself to constantly come from that place of transparency and vulnerability?
Something that's really helped me is committing to a practice of being able to receive feedback that I wouldn't want to hear. For example, if I sit down and I sort of emotionally prepare myself and say, I'm going to ask for feedback, and when I get it, not going to defend myself. I'm not going to try to say, well, it's not that or not this. I'm just going to listen. And seeking out people who are willing to tell me the truth and sit with me if I have any sort of resistance and defensiveness come up, and just stay through it, to sit in the presence of criticism, and to own the fact that, oh, well, in that situation, I did act like that. I did, and so to really get into the ownership and the emotional sovereignty that I'm willing to see that everything around me and all the feedback I'm getting in the world is in some way a reflection of the energy that I am giving. So finding the place of which is my responsibility in everything, and being willing to share with that and speak to it, and then sit in the discomfort or even just awkwardness and not try to smooth anything over or fix anything, but just be like, yes, like, there's truth there.
So that's something I can really do better at applying in my own life. What would be like the specific, like one or two questions you would ask somebody if you were just like a friend or somebody that you knew and you were just sitting down with them and just asking them for candid feedback? Like what question would you use?
So I build this into my life, and I notice that contextually, I'll start with this phrase and I'll say, are you experiencing me as XYZ? Are you experiencing me as, like right now I could say, are you experiencing me as talking too much? Are you experiencing me as trying to prove something, or do you feel my curiosity? I'm really curious. And then as you respond to me, I'm prepared that like I asked you for the truth. How receptive I am actually is going to contribute to, I feel, how willing you might or be to actually sharing something that's all vulnerable for you to say. So I ask that. I tend to like throw in those little sentence prompts here and there and throughout my life, just to kind of like see, okay, is this what you're experiencing, or how are you experiencing me? Open-ended, noticing in patterns where the same things are happening, and then getting really focused to source, why is that pattern keep showing up? And that pattern is usually something that I'm unconscious about. So that acts as like a guidepost for me to find a place that I might have a hidden fear.
Both of those tactics are fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm definitely going to give those both a shot. I'm curious on the first one, when you ask people, are you experiencing me as X or Y? Have you gotten any, has every response you've ever received always been a beneficial one? Or have you ever gotten confusion or, continued awkwardness or anything like that?
Well, I will say both. I will say that every single thing has proven to be beneficial, but there may be a phase of awkwardness and confusion until the clarity comes, because it doesn't always come right away. So I have had people describe aspects of me that it took me a while, like within the following month or 2 months, to actually start to see it happen, for me to see it happen in myself. And it was almost like they planted a seed, and I'm like, well, okay, I listened to that. But then I had to actually be in a context where they planted the seed, and then I saw myself act that way. And then I'm like, oh, I'm starting to understand. Okay, stay with it. So, and some of those have been really uncomfortable. There's definitely like, the process of self-awareness is the light and the dark.
That's really good to hear. And it definitely helps to just kind of demystify that a little bit. I'm sure that the listeners are probably agreeing with me that it's definitely just, scary to just go to somebody who you love or somebody who's a friend, just be like, hey, like, what do you think of me? That's a scary thing.
Yeah.
But potentially, like you said, it always comes back around to being a really good thing. So I really appreciate that. Question for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think everything we talked about today is absolutely fantastic. I know I got a lot out of it. I know everybody's going to get a lot out of it. If you had to give like one easy to implement thing that people should go and do, that I should go and do following this conversation, like what would that one thing be?
The first thing that comes to mind is to get really curious and observe where there's heightened emotion, like reactivity or anger or sadness. What are the patterns of where those emotions are coming up? Starting to just notice the pattern in those emotions. I often, at least for me, I find that helped me gain clarity on what in this world I uniquely care about the most. And it's that care that drives the purpose. So I think that emotions can be really messy and really resisting. And I'm not advocating the rise in drama, but the wisdom within our feelings. Let's say I find myself angry 8 to 10 times within a week or within a month. What are the patterns within those contexts of what's the similar thing that might have happened? Obviously context is changing all the time as we live our life, but then there's something that's follow through. So there's something that my body's saying, wait, I care about that. I'm trying to tell you something. Wait, there's something off here. And so being like, oh, wow, that anger is this sort of sweet nectar that's pointing me towards where I might uniquely be positioned on this earth to bring care.
I want to find ways in my life to do that more. And I think you've given me a couple strategies for places I could go, and I could, ask questions on a regular basis and set reminders for myself so that I'm always thinking about, being mindful and thinking about, hey, where are some heightened emotions where I should get more curious and really think through the impact those are having, and therefore the action I should take. I would probably say that the most beneficial thing for me has been looking back at the past
Mhm.
in attempting to create my purpose for the future, right? And so really getting curious, like you said, use that word a lot, really getting curious about your past, and thinking through which things brought me the most fulfillment out of anything, and trying to find the common threads there, try and find the common things that repeat themselves over the course of time, that are always showing that, hey, wow, this is something that I get a lot of fulfillment from, a lot of happiness from, a lot of, just, it lights a fire in me when I get a chance to do it. For me personally, that's just when I'm able to meet with somebody like one-on-one, or just connect with someone, or find out that I made an impact in their life by, helping them get through some sort of roadblock, either mental or actual, get through some sort of challenge that they're facing, or just helping them to think bigger about their own purpose. I mean, that's the stuff that just gets me so fired up, right? I mean, like you said, like I just start tingling, and like I feel the energy, and like that's that's what led me to create the mission that I did, is because I knew that even on the worst day, I would get so much just like fire in my life from doing that thing.
Which is that, like, reminds me of the aliveness, living alive. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Gareth, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. Where can people find you if they want to connect with you, if they want to hear more?
So let'sseelabs.com is where these films have been put online. So my name's Gareth Gwyn, as you introduced in the beginning. And yeah, I would love anybody to come check it out. Find me on there, my email's on there, and just connect.
That's awesome. Well, hey, Gareth, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it, and look forward to doing it again soon.
Yeah, likewise. I love what you're doing, fully behind it. So thank you so much.